Hi, I'm Professor Green, and today we'll be talking about Chapter 9, Sustainability, Development, and Global Business. Let's go ahead and get started. So the first slide here talks about the Chapter 9 key learning objectives. Let's go through these. So we're going to first understand how business and society interact within the natural environment. We're going to talk about defining sustainable development. If you've heard that term before, we're going to get into a lot of detail as to what that actually means and what that means also for a business manager, most importantly, in this context. We're going to be recognizing the ways in which population growth and economic development interact with the world's ecological crisis, which is super interesting to see how the population is developing in the world on this earth. We're going to be examining common environmental issues, including climate change, that are shared by all nations and businesses. We'll be analyzing the steps both large and small businesses can take globally to reduce ecological damage and promote sustainable development. And lastly, we'll be describing the leading global codes of environmental conduct so that you as managers are familiar with those codes and you can speak to these ideas and issues. If you work in CSR or not, all managers really need to be familiar with how the environment affects day-to-day operations of any business. So let's start to talk about business society in the natural environment, right? And so business and society operate within constraints of the planet and its natural resources, right? And so what is natural capital? Let's just define that for a minute. This is the world stock of natural assets, including its geology, soil, air, water, and all living things. And we have some nice pictures here of plants, some water, some fresh air, etc. And the slide here says for a human society to survive over time, it must operate sustainability so that natural resources are preserved for future generations, right? So let that sink in for a moment that you as a manager are going to be making decisions for the next 30, 40 years. And a lot of these decisions will be impacted by the environment, and a lot of your decisions will impact the environment, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about this on our next slide, but we want to get you all familiar with what these decisions can include potentially. So the last point on this slide is that preserving our common ecosystem is an urgent imperative for governments, business, and society. So this slide I really like because, as I just mentioned, you all will be sitting here in business as decision makers, and coming in and out is society, right? So we've spoken about that already in this course, right? This course is all about how business leaders interact with society and many stakeholders within the society. What we're including in this chapter now is the natural environment. So again, we have arrows going back and forth into the society, right? And because businesses are so intertangled with society, it's all one big circle. So it's an interactive system. So as we spoke about in the first slide, sustainable development, what is that? Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Sustainable development requires that human society use natural resources at a rate that can be continued over an indefinite period of time. That's a big to-do item, right, on all of our tasks, right? Indefinite period of time, right? How much time, are we going to have? How many trees do we have left to cut down? How many, coral reef areas do we have to protect from pollution? So we need to think about these things lasting for forever. And the last point here, sustainable development is about fairness, right? The benefits and burdens of the use of natural resources must be distributed equitably between developed and developing nations, right? We'll talk a little bit about that in this chapter, right? How developed nations, right, have more money, so they might have more potential to help and not corrupt those developing nations that really maybe survive on these natural resources, right? I think of countries like Ecuador or a lot of countries in Latin America, right, that have to cut down trees to sell, to support their economy, to sell for paper products, right? So there's a fine balance between developed and developing countries, and then also between present and future generations, right? So maybe you're of the mindset like, who cares? I'm not going to have any kids, so it doesn't really matter if we have water for the next 100 years. But that is an issue, right? Most of you don't fall in that bucket. So we want to make sure that our children and our grandchildren have enough water, have enough trees, have enough clean air. Good. So let's go ahead and hop into the next slide. Let's talk about the threats to the Earth's ecosystem. Let me just check my notes here so I don't miss anything. Okay, great. So, right. So here we talk about where humanity has entered a new era, right? Anthropotency, right? Anthropotency, a big word, in which human activity has become the dominant influence on climate and the environment. So now businesses face three things, right? Limited supply of critical resources. That's talking about, right, our shortage of water here in California. We're in the middle of a huge drought. Unpredictable weather changes. I don't know if anybody follows the weather in Europe, but the Czech Republic had a tornado for the first time a month or two ago, for the first time in like 100 years. So very, very strange. Like, why are these things happening? Right? Tornadoes are mostly happening in Kansas and places where there are very dry, open land, not necessarily in places where in the Czech Republic where there's dense population. And then there's also increased political risk, right? A huge one also that shifts now because businesses have to deal with these things. Afghanistan obviously is a big issue, right? Because now there's huge political risk from the Middle East, and a lot of businesses will have to engage with that risk. Right, we can go into that, but that's a whole other bucket. Let's go ahead and keep going. Let's talk about how businesses also have great opportunities. So on the opposite side, right? So here now, established firms and innovative entrepreneurs who can figure out how to address environmental challenges can both help society and enjoy great commercial success. So for some of you, you might go into a startup that does something really great for the environment. And there are all these amazing fintech and really innovative people who want to fund these types of environmentally based projects and companies. So if anybody ever wants to do that, I have lots of contacts in that area, and I'm happy to connect you with that. It's just a really emerging and exciting area where people really want to fund these environmental initiatives. Let's go ahead and hop into forces of change, accelerating ecological crisis. So here there are two critical factors that have combined to accelerate the ecological crisis facing the world economy and to make sustainable development more difficult. Right, we're going to go deep into both the population explosion and also economic development. Right, so we already have a photo here of a city, and there are a lot of clouds. And we're going to talk a little bit about the greenhouse gases and how those, and how when there's a lot of population and things like that, how the air gets dirty, the water gets dirty, et cetera, not to oversimplify it, but that's the idea. Let's go into the population explosion. What does this mean? So a major driver of environmental degradation is the exponential growth of the world's population. And you might think like, how is that possible, right? That the millennials are having less kids. How can the world overall be growing in population when developed countries like the US and Europe are sustaining or even dropping in population? We're going to get into that. It's all about Africa, right? So the second sentence here says many more people would be added during the second 50 years than for the first, even though the rate of growth would stay the same. Right, because there's just exponentially more people being born. And so this is what I was just alluding to, right? It's all about Africa. So the population of the world and in major areas, they project this up into the year 2100. So the world is growing very, very quickly. And it's because Africa, as you can see, is this black line going up very, very quickly. Asia is kind of going to be sustaining itself, even dropping, right? Because of, China has set limits on the number of children that you're allowed to have, and just in general, so many of those developed countries are limiting or are not so interested in having big families any longer. You'll also find it interesting, I would hope, right, that here, Europe It's kind of sustaining itself. It's even dropping. Um, Maybe some of you know or don't know, I have a Czech passport because my mother's from the Czech Republic, and if I had gotten that passport before I was 39, I would have had 2 free rounds of in vitro fertilization included in my healthcare, because the Czech Republic, the population is dropping, and so they're really encouraging um, women to have children, and that includes freezing your eggs. So super, super interesting. I did do IVF as a side note in the Czech Republic, but I was already 41, and so I had to pay for it. Wasn't that expensive, thankfully. And just so you know, it didn't work. But I did conceive naturally a couple of months later. But anyway, the whole point of the story is that, right, that these countries actually have a problem because not an environmental problem when it comes to population growth. They have a problem because they can't necessarily sustain the pensions, right? That the Social Security and the funding for their retirees. So they have a different problem. But when it comes to environmental and ecological issues, they're doing well for those types of things. And so then the last 2 countries here, we have North America, which is sustaining for the most part, as I mentioned. And Latin America is in here too, also kind of overlapping here with Europe sustaining, and the one bottom all the way here, Oceania, which is New Zealand, Fiji, Australia, and Papua New Guinea. Great, let's hop on to the next slide. Okay, economic development. So here we talk about that this is another source of pressure on the Earth's resource base. It's the rapid industrialization of many countries. And so I like to think of Mexico City or Mexico when I think about this slide, right? So the advantages of Mexico is that we're reducing, when there's more economic development, right, we're reducing poverty and slowing the population growth, right? As we spoke about in the previous slide. And also the advantages that development is also accompanied by rising incomes, right? So the people of Mexico now have more money to spend. But the disadvantages here are that economic development has also contributed to growing ecological crisis, right? So if you think of the panoramic view of Mexico City, so often you see this huge smog layer, right? If you've ever been to Mexico City, you know that it's so highly polluted, the air, the streets, etc. So even though Mexico has grown and developed, which is really great, so many amazing businesses that come out of Mexico these days, they're having an environmental issue, right? And so also rising incomes bring higher rates of consumption and waste, right? So if you have more money, then you're eating out more, you're using more plastic, you're using your car more, you're using more gas, et cetera, et cetera. So, and the last one is, in many instances, environmental regulations have lagged the pace of development. And so we'll just study that as well as in this chapter. What are the environmental regulations that exist today globally? But as a whole, they lag the pace of development. So in this instance, in this example, right, Mexico has somewhat limited environmental regulations. Previous slide, I wanted to point out, right, when we talk about Africa here growing so quickly, why is Africa's growth moving so quickly? And that is because there is a betterment of healthcare, which is great. They're increasing their life expectancy. They also have a decreasing infant mortality rate, which are all good things. But they also have limited use of contraceptions because there's a little bit of a lack of education around these things. So people are having big families, right? And that is not projected to change anytime soon, for better or for worse, right? In this chapter, we're saying it's for worse because we're talking about the environment. Great, so let's go ahead and talk about the Earth's carrying capacity. So here we talk about the Earth's resource base as essentially finite, right, or bounded, right? We only have so many coral, we only have so many trees, we can only grow trees so fast. We only have so much water. Even though water is a renewable resource, we can't make enough drinkable water as fast as we can drink it. We'll go into that again further in this chapter. If human societies use up resources faster than they can be replenished, and create waste faster than it can be dispersed, environmental devastation will be the inevitable result. Human society is already overshooting the carrying capacity of the Earth's ecosystem. So already overshooting, that's a pretty broad statement, right? What do they mean by that? How do they know they're shooting this, right? How do we measure this? So that's the next slide, the ecological footprint. You probably heard of this before, right? What is your ecological footprint? Or what is a business's, what is an organization's ecological footprint? So this is a method to measure the Earth's carrying capacity and how far human society has overshot it. It refers to the amount of land and water a human population needs to produce the resources it consumes and to absorb its waste given prevailing technology. And this last bullet point here says that society is now using resources and producing waste at a greater than 1.5 times what the ecosystem can sustainably support. But some nations are doing better than others, right? So it says that in the book that some nations have bigger footprints than others, right? The US has typically, each person has 5 times his or her share of natural resources. That's quite a bit, right? That we use, you drink 5 times more water every day than the Earth can potentially create for our lifetime or for eternity. Bangladesh, on the other hand, though, is doing much better. They have less than half. So somehow they're figuring things out when it comes to the environment. Good, let's go hop into the next slide. So how can human society restore the balance between Earth's carrying capacity and society's demands? There are 3 major pieces to this slide. First is the technological innovation. We develop new technologies to produce energy, food, and other necessities of human life more efficiently and with less waste. So an example here is the genetic engineering of food, right? There's a bad side to genetic engineering of food, but when we talk about the environment, it's a good thing, right? That we can use less soil, we can use less fertilizer, and still get the same amount of food out of the ground. Very important. There are changing patterns of consumption. I see the misspelling here, patterns of consumption. Individuals and organizations concerned about environmental impact could decide to consume less or choose less harmful products or services. So this is what I think of as like using LED lights, right? Most of us in our homes now, we use LED lights, and those are because they use a lot less energy than traditional light bulbs, right? And there are even apps out there to help find a product that has a lower environmental impact. So really interesting. If you're looking for a particular product like light bulb, whatever, you can download these apps and they can tell you which type of light bulb are best for the environment. The third part of this slide is getting the prices right. Right? Some economists have called for public policies that impose taxes on environmentally harmful products or activities, right? And so we see this all the time, right? The price of gas just went up, right? Because we want to encourage people to drive less because the car emits emissions that hurt the environment. Another example is carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels. So again, organizations who emit these carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels, they get they're in a higher tax bracket, or they get additional taxes when they do such things. So there's a penalty to doing these things that harm the environment. The next thing are some global environment issues. Here we're going to talk about commons and then the tragedy of the commons. And you already see this illustration here. This will be the end of part 1 of this chapter, chapter 9, this last slide, and then I'll create a whole new video for you for part 2 of chapter 9. So we're talking about fishing here, right? So the commons, a shared resource such as land, air, or water that a group of people use collectively. So fishing grounds. So the paradox of the commons is if all individuals attempt to maximize their own private advantage in the short term, the commons may be destroyed, and all users present and future lose, right? And so if we farm fish too quickly, we will farm fish too quickly, we will eventually run out of fish, right? Because the fish can't reproduce as fast as we can farm them. So the only solution is restraint, either voluntary or through mutual agreement. So if we, right, fish less, then um, then we have more fish, right? And so the tragedy of the commons is that the freedom and in a commons brings ruin to all. So, right, so if we just let everybody have a free reign of fishing, then everybody loses, unfortunately. So there have to be some common grounds as to how we work with these commons. No pun intended. Great. So that finishes my first half of chapter 9. I'll go ahead and give you a break, and I'll create a whole new video for you for the second half of chapter 9.